Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to Commercial Real Estate Secrets. I'm your host, Austin Hare, and today our guest is Brucker Kraft and Alex Raftar. They're the founders and principals at Labruta Capital, which is a special situation fund that invests in financially challenged companies that are thinking about bankruptcy, but now they don't have to. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to have you guys on the show. How's it going today, everybody?
Good, man. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, fantastic, Austin. Yeah, thanks for having us once again.
Yeah, you're welcome. So it's cool to see, our paths cross. I know, Brucker, you and I originally met doing at a business buying conference, last year, back before COVID really broke out. And so it's really interesting to see how this whole thing has taken off. So yeah, I'm curious. I'm sure everybody's curious to know like what your guys' background is and how you kind of got into this industry.
Yeah, man. So I was a career soldier by trade, got a little too banged up, passed on a big promotion and got out instead. Did various things for a while, decided I wanted to work for myself. So essentially I started a construction company, and getting into the M&A space, where we met, Austin, was my intention was to educate myself more so that I could acquire bolt-ons for my company, my construction company, and grow through acquisitions. And that just quickly evolved into what we're doing today in a nutshell. Inadvertently ran into Ali down the road, and we were birds of a feather. Essentially, we both saw in each other people that action and execute on the highest level efficiently. We said, hey, we would make a great team. Let's do something. And here we are.
Yeah, that's cool. And so, Ali, what about you? What's your background that led you to this path?
That's a great question, Austin. Well, similar to you, I was actually in real estate back in the day, just on the note buying and distress side of it. Started my career in 2007. I promise I did not cause the housing market crisis, albeit I may have some influence there. But yeah, we were doing settlements of mortgage notes, people who were undergoing foreclosure, they were non-performing, institutionalizing those notes, basically bundling them together, making them more attractive, rating them, fixing the problems that were there. And essentially, delegating those tasks to analysts and stuff to create something meaningful and resell them and create a lot of delta. From that, we saw opportunity in businesses because we noticed that a lot of commercial loans were issued without consideration of what the underlying asset was. So we saw a lot of opportunity in distressed transactions for businesses who are far greater than the housing market crisis, which is like a shadow banking activity that nobody talks about. So from that perspective, coming here over 1,700 comfortably transactions done through the consulting firms and the individuals we work with. Here we are today, Labruta Capital. We just made it a little bit more streamlined. But that's initially the background, Austin.
Okay. So essentially you were looking at distressed mortgages back in 2007 and you learned that entire process. That led to you looking at distressed loans for businesses. And then that's when you kind of realize like, hey, there's a lot of opportunity here. So this is something that was like going on over the course of the last 13, 14 years, or has there been certain cycles where you had significant transition points?
Yeah, that's a very good point. To answer your question, it has been going on for the last decade or so. It became more apparent, I would say, in the last decade or so. And then the reason why it's because the housing market crisis kind of revealed the underlying underwriting principles of some of these institutions and how vulnerable they are. And so there's more governance and regulation that stepped in to make sure that the banks are kind of acting in the best interest of people and not just going out there and making, gambles and just lending out aggressively, right? But I'd say like this has always been in existence. It's just recently it came to light. The aggressive lending practices and the consideration of how to lend and so on and so forth. So we saw a lot of over leveraged situations, right? And this is where we saw the opportunity because that created some sort of deal flow for us, right? Because we were already in that space and we knew exactly how to articulate the transactions and how to understand them and navigate those waters. It became a little bit more familiar territory. And so we take the lead on that in terms of these distressed transactions. We're pretty much the only one in the United States, I would say, that can preserve the personal guarantee of individuals because we have a program designed for that, right? And we can do it really well. And probably one of the fastest transaction, streamlined processes out there in the United States within 30 to 45 days. So yeah,
that's a big deal, obviously, because like when you sign a personal guarantee, that's what causes bankruptcy. That's what causes insolvency. And that can take 7+ years to get that off your record. So, I mean, you're talking about life-changing events, right? So let's talk. Yeah, let's dive into detail about Labruta Capital and the kind of the specialty that you serve. So essentially, what you're looking for is businesses that are they just have taken on more debt than they can serve, right? Is there any other like niche to that, or is that does that sum it up?
Yeah, man. So we're looking for businesses that would be viable, profitable businesses if the debt were removed. Businesses that are functioning at a good level, but that are so overwhelmed by debt that they have no apparent value and that they're unable to essentially pay their debt. But once that debt's removed, you have a good, viable business. So essentially, as far as markets and industries, we don't really have anything we don't fool with. We don't have anything we're specifically looking for. It's a very altruistic and philanthropical thing, Austin, that we set out to do here. And we make money at the same time. So, it's a beautiful thing. It's helping every aspect of the economy. It's saving the business owners from foreclosure and all the secondary and tertiary effects of that in their lives and people that depend on them immediately, their family. It's saving the business from going belly up, and it's saving the employees of the business. And it's saving the bankers and various commercial lending institutions from toxic debt on their books.
Okay, so the lenders also benefit in this situation because you're giving them an out. You're paying them something for the debt that otherwise they would just have to eat the entire cost.
Yeah, more or less. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes. So if you look at it, just to iterate, sorry about that. I just want to, because this is an important point, right? Normally we look at lenders and we think like, oh, they're going to aggressively foreclose and then we'll lose our business. Think about it this way, in the lender's perspective, the headaches that it will take to undergo a judicial route and go through restructuring and bankruptcy to somehow liquidate those assets down the road from a non-operating business because they foreclosed on it. So there's nothing existing there that creates cash flow. Now, what are the chances that those assets during the time of auction are actually going to be sold at the premium that they desire? It's very rare because in most instances, people could put 10 to 20% down and get brand new assets with warranties on them. So they're coming against something that commercially isn't viable, plus the legal cost to get to that route. So we try to create a transaction that looks at all these scenarios and the negative aspects of that scenario of going through bankruptcy and tell the lender like here's a way out that is friendly in contrast to what you would undergo anyways. And we create a delta for them and say, look, it's an incentive for you to walk out because this prevents any type of collection activities in the future that would give you headaches, frustrations, and just get you nowhere real fast. So that's pretty much the reason for lenders to get incentivized from our transaction.
Okay. Do you guys have any examples we could walk through, like hypothetical examples of what it would look like with some real numbers and a certain type of business? Does it need assets, or can it be based on cash flow? Can you provide detail there too?
Sure. Yeah. So let's assume that it doesn't necessarily always need to have assets or so on and so forth. It's better if it does. Now, it doesn't mean that the assets have to exceed the debt. You know, ideally, we're looking for debt assets that don't exceed the debt. So an example would be, let's say a business has $10 million of debt, and there are multiple lenders in that liability chain. But then you have a business that's worth the same business is worth $5 million in its enterprise value, including let's say $2 million of assets. Of the 10 million, let's say SBA has 2.5 of that, and they're first position creditor. They're the senior creditors in this business. We essentially offer and incentivize the SBA to walk out. Once we do, what ends up happening is this asset that the business has, which is 2 million, we'll look at what the forced liquidation value of that asset is. Once we step in, we tell the other subordinate creditors that are the $7.5 million worth of debt that look, the business still owes us 500. We're doing a friendly foreclosure using the Article 9. That's the transaction we use. It's a non-judicial transaction. And now what happens is that debt gets eliminated from the balance sheet. Now let's assume the personal guarantees are still in place for the 7.5. What ends up happening is now because the business can support the new structure that we set up and the debt is no longer parasitically eating away from the balance sheet, we generate new cash flow. From this cash flow, we do a W-2 income to the ex-owner to keep them on as consultant, and we allow them to settle those personal guarantees over time, usually 10 to 20 cents on the dollar. So the 7.5 would equate to 750,000 over time and or $1.5 million. And what instantly happens there is you've created opportunity where otherwise wouldn't be possible from a lot of perspective of either private equity and or opportunistic investment bankers, right? So that's the program in its entirety.
Okay. And so can you explain that real quick again about the SBA? Because I know SBA, like they are like they're government backed. I mean, they're big fish. They're extremely hard to deal with, especially when it comes to personal guarantees.
Right.
So essentially, are you settling with them for most of the amount, or did you say that you're working a discount with them too?
Right. So when we approach the SBA, we're looking at what their first position amount is. So let's say the dollarized value here is 2.5 million, right?
Okay.
If it needs to be a slight discount for sure as a negotiating factor, but also let them walk away because they're whole again at a discount, right? So they can undergo a release of those personal guarantees. Essentially, is what we're looking for. So that releases them, but beyond that, now they don't have to be there anymore because we're replacing their position. So we control and basically we create the dialogue for how the transaction will go moving forward once we step into their shoes, and that's what we call a friendly foreclosure. A friendly foreclosure simply means we're stripping the assets in the balance sheet, cleaning up the debt, divorcing it entirely, and just telling the other subordinate creditors that look, right now at this point, there's nothing there, so we'll have to, collect. We tell the creditors you can buy our position up, but there's no financial incentive to do so from a subordinate creditor perspective, right? Because then the business will still owe them a $500,000. So it just doesn't make sense. So that's how we deal with the SBA. We know we're not in a position to strong arm them or anything like that. But at us, like we look at SBA as an opportunity as well, because they're first position. And for us, if it means that, hey, look, you want to be whole again, if we're going to pay you whatever you're owed, plus or minus a small discount just to make sure that we benefit from this, right? What would be the judicial cost of you going foreclosure on this, right? What's the likelihood of you collecting anything, and so on and so forth. So that's how we step into the SBS territory. So in a sense, this is essentially a friendly way of saying, we'll replace you, you can walk out, instead of really strong arming them or negotiating with them, because the goal is to replace them so that we have the benefit of the first mover's advantage.
Yeah, I'm sure like the longer that the loan or the borrower is delinquent, the more incentivized they are to work with you. Is there a certain sweet spot into that in terms of like how long the borrower is delinquent for before you start to see the SBA really be open to the negotiation?
Um, because we're dealing with COVID, there's always going to be some deferment plans and stuff that we have to consider. But let's say, conditionally, right at this moment, it's a little bit difficult. But standard, if it wasn't for COVID and the pandemic, usually we're looking at, 3 to 6 months of leg room in reference to delayed payments. So it's like a personal credit profile, right? So there's another thing in my background. I talk a lot about personal guarantees and personal credit. I treat it the same as a business because you're the captain of your ship anyways. So if you sign a personal guarantee, how you'd have handled your credit card payments and debt obligations usually translates into business activity. And not to be disrespectful, it's just habitually there's a lack of financial knowledge in a lot of areas, but treat it like so. So let's say a credit card company waits maybe 60 to 90 days until they sent you a collection notice. And from that perspective, if you fail to meet that at 120 days, they now charge it off. So it's an uncollectible activity. It's unsecured, so they have no choice but to charge it off, right? And then it goes to a collection agency and it just hammers your credit reports. In this instance, from a creditor's perspective, the collection activity is a notice to seize assets and or foreclose on your business. And you delay the inevitable, what ends up happening is they will execute on that order and they will have judgments issued against it because you have signed, a waiver of liability in that case, right? Because you can't defend yourself because you signed the personal guarantees and they already have liens against your business. So we have to be really careful when we're navigating that space, specifically when you're a secured lender. So usually that's the time frame.
Okay, so that would be when you say that's the time frame. Are you talking about after that 90-day period?
Yeah. So as you're approaching that 90 days, it's probably the time you want to give us a call.
Okay.
Right. If you're surpassing that, obviously your bankruptcy attorney can try to help you, but that's why 75% of bankruptcies fail because there's just not a way for them to assist you.
It's a pretty small window. It's really between that 30 and 90 days that you got to take action.
That's right. Yeah,
okay.
Usually.
That's good. Yeah, that's good to know. So go ahead, Brooker. We're about to say something.
Yeah, so as well, if the writing's on the wall, you don't have to be in that window. Reach out to us whenever you can. We can help you position appropriately to be able to extend the lifeline as well. But that's almost the window Ali's describing is pretty much your executable window. But if you're ahead of that and the writing is on the wall and it's coming, reach on out to us. Let's help you position strategically so that everyone's safe and saved here. If you're past it, if you're outside that window, if you're borderline falling off the cliff, reach out to us. We're going to do the best we can.
Okay. And so talk about this from like the business owner's perspective as well, in terms of equity and ownership and stuff like that. How does this shake out? Because I know you're coming in as a creditor, right? Does the owner maintain full ownership of the business, or is there anything that is transferred when Labruta comes in?
So in order for us to do what we need to do, we need to take over 100% equity in the company. We want to keep the owner involved. Obviously, they know the ins and outs of that business. We can even, once the debt's removed, the option exists to refinance the company back to the owner as a debt-free enterprise, other than their, newer buying costs, essentially their financing. But the owner has to be removed initially, or we don't have any leverage with creditors, and we're unable to resolve and divorce the debt from the business with the owner still being an equity holder. They won't talk to us otherwise.
Okay.
Right, right. And just to slightly elaborate on that point, and to broker's point, that is, and that's a great question, Austin. You have to think about it this way: we're stripping off maybe 75% of. I'm assuming based on the metaphorical example we discussed, 75% of subordinate creditors, right? If the owner stays on, what's stopping those creditors based on the personal guarantee the owner signed to foreclose on the deal, right? Because they're secondary anyways. So,
Okay.
in order to conduct this transaction to make it sure that they can walk away and have peace of mind, they need to make sure that they exit their position. It's very critical. Article 9 demands it so, but also it's for their protection. So let's say if they stayed on, what's the chances that they can actually sell it for 10 to 20 cents on the dollar? Very unlikely, right? We've seen 70 cents, 60 cents on the dollar, and they think that's a huge win, but then they have to sell their house and give up, the lifestyle just to get to that point, which can be very critical. In addition to giving up 80% of their business's cash flow for the next 10 years, which is essentially now they're working for creditors, right? So we always have to think in the logistical sense, where what's the risk to the owner if they stayed on? The purpose of doing this is to get them the freedom that they need. If they're off their personal guarantees, if we help them settle, if they walk away without the feel of stress and the burden, and being the one to give bad news to the employees, looking up the creditor and looking at their family and saying, look, we have to sell the property, and going through the judicial route, which is extremely frustrating and time consuming. We're trying to avoid all that headache, right? And either way, you can't sell this type of business. A broker can promise you otherwise, and not to disregard or discount any business brokers, but 80% of the times they can't do anything with it, right? And
Well, you have an
80%.
insolvent business, right? I mean, the book value of the business might be around $2 million, $5 million, but the debt is 10 million. So you have a value of negative 5 to 8 million because they essentially taken off more debt than they can service.
Absolutely, you're right about that. Yeah.
Most brokers don't even want to list a business like this because they realize that it is completely unsellable. So, most of them won't even touch it.
All right, let's talk about the real estate strategies too, because a lot of times when you get companies of this size, they're purchasing their own real estate, and that would obviously be a factor in this equation. So how often do you come across like a situation where the real estate is involved, and then what do you do from there?
That's a very good question, Austin. Burke, I'm just going to answer this just for the sake of my background, because I like doing the real estate play. But let's look at it this way, Austin. So let's assume that there is a real estate in the transaction. But let's say the real estate in the transaction, because a lot of people are when they sign on transactions of this capacity, they do it under personal ownership, right? And a lot of real estate plays that happens where the SBA might have some sort of lean towards that as well. So our first objective is always to look at the goal of releasing any type of liens against personal assets, which would be that first position creditor, right? Or second position in this case. It could be mortgage being first position, or let's say SBA could be second, just simply because there's equity left in the deal. Once we wipe them off and we take their position, what we do is now there's delta in the real estate. We create a scenario where we can sell the real estate, right? Now, when we sell the real estate, and the reason this is important is because when you release the first lien, the other creditors don't have a way into that property. That's the first move we got to make. We got to release any type of connection between that property and a way in. It's like a bridge for the other creditors to attack it. So we isolate that property post transaction of releasing the lien from the SBA. Just an example, metaphorically speaking. From that perspective, we can create a new lease with the existing business for the new cash flow we've generated due to deficiency, and of course, wiping out the subordinate creditors, where the new lease would be an attractive term to a real estate investor, right? That can be a scenario we can create, and or just simply asset protected, so that that's no longer part of the equation, right? And then sign a new lease based on a new entity under the trust and or whatever asset protection vehicle we created. From that perspective, what happens is the real estate is literally, in a sense, forgotten and or forgiven in the transaction, in a sense of a piece of the pie that can be, bitten off of, right? So we have two plays here. A, we sell it to an investor, just simply with the new delta because of the new leases and the financial viability of the new lease based on the business's financial cash flow model we generate from post-transaction, or we retain it and we settle lease with ourselves, but it's a separate piece of the pie, right? So that's the way we see real estate. It's 20 to 30% of our transaction go through that, right? Because it's very frequent that a lot of people would personally own real estate and then they just have their business run out of that, even though their business is a completely different LLC, NRC, or S corp, right? It's just personal ownership is such a big thing in the United States that, and sometimes these are baby boomers too. There's a sense of pride of ownership, and we're not discounting that. It's an amazing thing they've accomplished, but at the same, that puts them at risk, and we can't afford to have them sit at that and be exposed to that kind of vulnerability or risk, right? So that's the game.
Okay. All right. So to explain that back, pretty much, because in the business side of things, with the business debt, it sounds like you are taking on 100% ownership. And so it'd be similar with the real estate too, like essentially coming in, taking over, settling up with the debt agencies, whoever they have debt on, and then taking ownership of that real estate. And then is that accurate? And then from that point, you can either resell it to an investor or hold it and lease it back to yourselves as the owner of the business.
Right. So in the real estate perspective, we don't necessarily need to take ownership. We can isolate the asset. We just need to make sure the liens are released so that the personal asset of the business owner is protected. Our goal is preservation of personal assets. Uh, this is a completely separate, I'm assuming in this scenario that we're discussing and the way I'm explaining it is based that, or it's on the premise that the owner actually owns the real estate piece individually on a personal level rather than the business. If it's owned by the business, then yes, we have no choice but to take over that, right? But if it's a personal ownership, then we have to execute something called an asset protection piece first, so that those assets are isolated from the transaction of doing the friendly foreclosure. So in those instances, we don't necessarily have to take the real estate. We just need to take out the parasites that are around that real estate piece, which is usually those liens. And usually it's the second position lien by the SBN or senior creditor. The mortgage is good. We're not concerned about that. That's a huge piece, right? But I'm talking about that equity that's been dragged into it and creditors taking on that, just releasing that, and then isolating the real estate thereafter, right? And then it's just simply not part of the transaction anymore. If it's personally owned, right? If it's not personally owned, then treat it as though it's a business transaction where you have to relinquish control and ownership. Because if you don't, then they'll find a way to go ahead and foreclose on that anyways, right? So that's just one of the major distinctions we need to clarify.
Okay. So from the outside looking in, it seems like that how could you, a lot of people might be asking, how can you get to a place where you owe so much money in debt, more so than the actual business is worth? Like, what are some ways that people get caught in this situation?
Lack of proper capitalization, especially entering into a catastrophic event like the COVID era, where people are unable to maintain cash flow and income, and they weren't well capitalized to start with. So essentially, as a business owner, a lot of business owners, this is their baby. So they're just in survival mode. They're taking anything they can get, be it PPPs, EIDLs, various state grants, SBA loans, personal loans, lines of credit, because they're all hoping for that light at the end of the tunnel. And as this time that was initially anticipated to be a month or two, just keeps getting put out and put out. We're a year in now. When you're in survival mode, you're just doing whatever it takes until essentially you hit the end.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any industries that you guys are seeing are getting hit harder than others?
Same thing you're seeing, Austin. Travel, hospitality, secondary and tertiary industries that cater to the industries that you're seeing that are being hit in the media. Kind of across the board. There are some exempt industries in specific regions. For example, Louisiana, for example, construction is booming, and obviously I have a construction company, and it's just blowing through the roof. And a lot of areas are growing, but for the most part, anything involved, just about anything that puts people next to other people have been negatively impacted. And the various industries and distributors and manufacturers that they're buying and goods that relate to these industries,
Yeah. So is there a certain sweet spot that you guys like to work with, companies between certain size of annual revenue?
Want to take this one, Ali?
Yeah, sure. So more annual revenue is a good indicator. we prefer seeing maybe what the debt load looks like, right? So because we are looking basically in the transaction from a perspective of a creditor as a replacement creditor and or swapping their position, we look to see what the liabilities are, bankable liabilities, right? Not like shareholder equity and stuff. We don't, that's not, that's not fair to say. But we're looking bank liabilities. So if the transaction has 500,000 in bank liabilities, and we see like pre-COVID and or it was a healthy business, maybe they do 1 million a year or 1.5, whatever the case, that's fine. That's one of those minimum considerations. And we can go as high as 250 to 500 million in liabilities. That's not a problem. Actually, the bigger the better, because the special situation fund that we've designed is backed by family offices, private families, some of the centimillionaire ones and private discrete billionaire ones, in addition to institutional funds elected create delta in opportunities which otherwise wouldn't be possible either way. So the bigger the better, because their check writing capability and for underwriting and just going through the due diligence process is a lot more simplified than looking at 1,000 different deals at $500,000, right? Although we are in a position to create a smaller fund that capitalizes on that, so other people within the United States economy can join in on this, because it's an opportunity, it's an impact investment opportunity, right? But for the moment, between 500,000 in debt all the way up to 250 million and or 500 million, that's the sweet spot. Now, that's assuming the total debt in the business. First position, which inside that, that's a whole different ballgame, right? So we're looking at that debt load only to write a check of like 200 to 300,000 on the 500K perhaps, or on the 250 million, it could be 20, 30 million or something like that, right? So really, that's the sweet spot of what we're looking for.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. That's really helpful. And let's talk a little bit again. I want some more clarity around how the owner benefits. I know that, we're saving them from the personal guarantee, but how do you incentivize them to stay on with the company after, it's essentially acquired by Labruta?
Go ahead, Ali.
No, you're good, Brooker, please.
Okay. In any business acquisition, you're going to need the owner for a transition period for a multitude of reasons that we could talk about for hours and hours. Really, it boils down to what the owner wants to do. They can stay on. They're due to their asset protection and their personal guarantee protection. They're going to have to draw income from the business to subsist on. But we would like them. We would love them to be involved. But if they don't want to, that's fine as well. We're more than capable, and we have a plethora of people in our corner that are more than capable of driving and scaling up any business you can bring to the table. But just because we have to take over the equity from the owner, they can come back in. We would love for them to stay involved. We're happy to look at refinancing it back to the owner as a healthy, viable, profitable enterprise. But it's really up to them, Austin. They can stay or they can go. Either way, whatever their goal is.
Okay. All right, cool. So yeah, essentially the incentive to them is the fact that right now it's an insolvent company. They have way more debt than they can service and handle. And so if they stay on, they'll be able to reacquire this company that you potentially have put your life's work into.
Yeah, that potential very much exists. And it's an option. It's really, I dare say, it's probably one of our most preferable options.
Okay. Yeah, cool. So, in a nutshell, companies, for whatever reason, a lot of times during COVID, have found themselves in a situation where they just bit off more than they can chew. They took on more debt than they can handle. Economy didn't shake out. Things didn't shake out like they thought. Now they're somewhere between 30 and 90 days of being delinquent on their loans. Things aren't looking very good in the short-term future. And that's the perfect situation. If they have somewhere between $500,000 and $500 million in debt, that's a perfect situation where Labruta Capital can come in, take over essentially their debt, be their first position debt holder, restructure finances for them, and help them, get them on a path to reacquire the business as a profitable business instead of owning one right now that would be, insolvent or bankrupt. Is that kind of everything in a nutshell?
Yeah, I think so. But one thing as well, their debt doesn't have to be COVID based. It could be just business mismanagement or some other kind of a catastrophic event to that industry. It doesn't have to be based specifically on COVID. And if it was mismanagement and they do want to stay in the business, whenever we step in and start doing what we do, they're going to learn how to manage that company properly, organically and inherently, just by being involved through the process. So, it doesn't have to be COVID specific. I just want to stress that point. COVID's just the catastrophic event that everyone's affected by in this moment.
Yeah, that's great. No, I think it's awesome what you're doing. And, like there's a lot of people who are struggling right now. And even if that's the result of bad decision making, it doesn't make you a bad person, right? Like you could have just made bad financial decisions. And so giving people coming in, giving someone an outlet, a way out, a path forward, I think is an awesome thing to do. I think it's going to help the economy. It's obviously going to help the individual owners. And yeah, I'm super excited that we got a chance to talk about this and show people what their options are. I'll leave some email addresses in the show notes, and I'll put the website up as well so people can do some background research on it. But yeah, that sounds like a plan. And so this is good stuff. This is really entertaining and it's good to talk about. And I think it's just something that a lot of people don't talk about because there's a lot of, your pride is somewhat involved, right? Like it's hard to take ownership of a bad decision that you made. But if you can do that and you can take ownership of that and start looking, exploring other options, then potentially like that's the way out, right? That's how you can save yourself. So I think it's really good.
It really is. And there's no shame in making bad decisions. There's no shame in finding yourself in a position like the business owners we're discussing would be in. There's absolutely none. We've all made decisions. We've all been there. But sometimes, for the better of everything, sometimes the best thing you can do is get out of the way. And in the process, let some experts take the wheel, or someone that's better at something than you are potentially, and then learn from them so that you can step back in and be the best version of yourself in that position that you can be. There's absolutely no shame in it. We've all stepped on our toes before.
That's great. Yeah. Well, awesome, guys. This is fun. It's always interesting and cool learning about how these strategies relate to commercial real estate. Because business and commercial real estate, they really do go hand in hand with entrepreneurship. And we love talking about that here on the podcast. So thanks for your time. And I look forward to circling back with you guys and getting in touch and seeing how things are moving along in the future.
Yeah, man.
Thank you for having us, Austin.
Appreciate it.
Great.